Hello and welcome to Console Cowboys. So this is the long format version of the last video. In this one, we're going to go through how to code the Python code and how to work with the APIs and how to grab API keys and just kind of actually code it, not just an overview of what the code is doing. So if you already know how to code and you don't care about this, the last video is for you. If you're learning how to do this stuff, then this is the video for you, just so I don't waste people's time. So in the previous video, what we did was, we wrote this script and it grabbed all the addresses as the attacker was changing them. And that came out with the 5 addresses that we have here. And then from that, we also had the other one that had the times, right? So we see 5 p.m., but that's the first day. So that's just whenever we started the script. And then we have like a 10 o'clock at night. We have another 10 o'clock at night. We have a 3 in the morning and we have a 3 in the afternoon. So if we get rid of the outlier and then the random one from when we started the script, we're looking at like 3 p.m. till 10 p.m. Eastern time. So if the attacker's like me, maybe they are East Coast because I tend to work better in that, later afternoon, nighttime. Or this could be the morning for the attacker and maybe the attacker's located where that 3 p.m. is, 9 a.m. for them and they tend to check things in the morning. Things to think about, right? Now, what do we want to do with these addresses? Well, with these addresses, what we want to do is write a script that gets all of the internal transactions from the scammer. So we can see all the value that is sent to them from each of the people that were scammed. And we can count the number of totals of that. And then we can see how many actual transactions were sent to these addresses. So what we're going to need to do after we get them is parse and convert the transaction values from the transaction data. We'll need to total those values, and then we'll loop through all the addresses and get the total funds stolen, and we'll learn a couple other Python concepts along the way. But how do we actually do that? So to do that, we have to make a web call. So we're going to use our requests again, right? So we're going to say import requests. But another thing we have to do is use something that knows how to pull this data. So if you remember, in Etherscan, we actually have an API. And as you remember, Etherscan has all the historical data from the blockchain. So if we use the API key that is right here below, I have it masked out for mine, but you can create a free account. And with that free account, you can make 5 calls per second. And with that API key, if you click this API documentation right here, it'll open up and right here are all the API endpoints. So what we're going to do is look at the internal transactions. So if we type in internal transactions by address, you'll see the format of doing that. And if we copy pasted this in the browser, or if I just clicked it here, browser, what it's going to do is it's going to grab all the transactions for the one that had the pre-programmed in here and have the same URL format as right here. But we want to do this programmatically. So what it'll end up being is we're getting the TX list internal. This is the address we want to use. That's going to be our attacker addresses we have. We have a start block, an end block. I'm just going to get rid of those completely and just get all of them. And then we can do unlimited pages as well, I believe, with all. And you can sort them ascending or descending, and then you want to put your API key so that you can make a call to this API and authenticate to it, right? So in order to do this, what we could do is we can make this HTTP call with requests in Python. No problem. So we have requests, and we also need to import our API key. So much like the other videos where we were importing our keys via an environment variable so we don't expose them within our code, we're going to do that here with an OS module for operating system. And in order to do that, I'm going to copy paste in a piece of code here that does that. And the reason I'm copy pasting this and explaining it is I hurt my finger last night and it's bandaged up and it's kind of hard for me to type things. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of copy pasting, but one line at a time and explaining it. Right? So what we have here is we have our API key variable that we're creating, and we're using this OS module that we imported and saying, hey, get the environment variable that we named API key. Now, how do we use that? Well, that's pretty easy. All we have to do is say export API key equals, and then paste in your API key. And once you do that, if you're using this particular terminal with the Python script, you'll be able to use that key within your script, right? So once that's done, that goes into the API key variable. Now what we have to do is, before we start trying to loop through all the addresses, let's just do a minimal viable product, and let's use one address with requests and parameters and pull back the data from it. So in order to do this, what we're going to need to do is do a response variable. So I'm going to copy paste this in here. We're going to say response equals request.get. You should be familiar with this from the last one we did. And this time we're going to call the api.etherscan.io API, and that is just from that URL right here. I just stole that right from there. But we also have to deal with all these parameters. And the way that we're going to deal with these parameters is pretty simple. All we have to do is say params equals a variable which holds all our parameters. And that's actually pretty easy as well. All it really is a list of kind of value key pairs. So let me paste this in here right above. So all we're saying here is that Etherscan parameters, which is our variable that we're grabbing right here, is equal to all the different parameters. Module equals account, action equals our TX internal. We gotta grab all the internal transactions. Address equals whatever our target address is. So we can paste one of these in here. So we say copy, and we'll just define one of these addresses for now. We'll say target address equals, and we will grab one of our target addresses here. So we'll say this first one. And that should be pretty easy. I think we got to put that in quotes. So we'll just paste that in here. So now we have that, and then we have our API key, and that is coming from our environment variable. So with that, we have a list here of all the parameters that we need right from this API, except we changed a couple of them in here. So what we did was we got rid of, let's see what we got here. We got rid of the start and start block. And so we're just going to grab everything from that address. We're going to still sort them by ascending. Doesn't really matter in our case. We're going to use our target address, TX internal, and the API key. And we're omitting a few values because we don't need to be as fine-grained as that particular call. So you can do that with the APIs. It'll just utilize what you're doing. Kind of like when you're doing a SQL call to a SQL database. If you're a database administrator, you can add ascending formatting, or you can not add that, or you can search for different field values, or you can omit them. Same exact thing here. So we're going to get that URL and toss those parameters in there. It's going to come back in a response object. Once it comes back in a response object, what you'll notice is that on the web page, we actually got JSON. So that would be this right here. So this is our JSON values. So what we want to do is grab it with JSON here. We'll say data equals our response object right here, .json get result. And the result is going to be all of our values here, right? Here's the result. The result is all of these different transactions are within this result. So that's what we want to grab. And now that we have that, what we can do is try to parse things out. So what we're going to want to do is loop through each of those transactions and print them out. So we can do that by creating a for loop. So in order to do that, let's say for transaction in data, and we'll say print. All right, my whole screen froze up on me, so I am back, but let's see here. So we were gonna do a for transaction in our data, and what we wanna do is print out something from the actual data that comes back, right? So if we look here, we have block number, timestamps, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just grab the block number. So we can say print the text block number : and then we're going to say transaction which is our transaction right here from our data, dot get, and we're just going to say block number, and it should print that out. So what we can do here is we should be able to just run this now, I believe. So let me give this a try. So we'll say Python 3, and we want to do attacker transactions. And right here, we just got all the block numbers, and there's a bunch of them here. So in order to count them up, so we don't have to count them up manually, we can also add an enumerator here. So let's say in Python, we can add an enumeration with any value we want. So we could say count, that could be anything we want it to be. And then we can say right before this data, enumerate. And that will give us a counting variable that will enumerate each data value that we can also print out. So we can say here, let's say, we'll go print, and it's an F string here. So in the F strings, I think I said what these were before, but essentially this is just a string you're printing out, but within it, you can put these curly brackets and then put variables in here. So in this case, the count, right? So we could say transaction, and then this is the number here. So now we're going to get a count of that as well. So let's run this again. That way we don't have to count it ourselves. So boom, we have 21 transactions in this first address. And then we have all of the, just, you know, the block numbers that they came in on. Block numbers, not all that useful for us. We're kind of looking for the values. So we could take a look at the value quite easy. Let's just grab that here. So let's say, I'm going to paste this in here, and then I'll explain what it's doing. So here's what we're doing here. We're saying print the text value, and we're going to say cast it to an int. So we're going to grab the transaction.get, and we're going to grab the value. And the value is just right here, right? So within the result, we're going to grab this value right here. This is 0. Value here is, 1 ether, I believe, whatever that is. So what we're doing is grabbing that value, but in Ethereum, this is coming back as way, and way has, 18 zeros after it, right? So what we can do is we can divide it by 1 with 18 zeros, and we should get the actual ether value. It's not the most precise way to do it. It's not technically the right way to do it. There's probably better functionality to do it, but this is just a quick and dirty way to get a mostly accurate number. We're not dealing with very precise things here. We're just trying to get an idea of what's going on. So what we can do is get rid of this block number because we don't even care about it, right? So let's just get rid of it completely. And let's just print out the values this time. And we'll say here, and then you're going to see transaction 21 ether, or transaction 21 is 0.32 ether. Transaction 19 is 0.04 ether. So this gives us all the values within the contract. And what we could do is we could total those up. So let's just add in our things here first. We'll say, okay, so the first thing we're doing is getting all of the transactions from the attacker. We did that, right? So that's just right here with this response object. Boom, so that one's done. We're gonna parse and convert the transaction values from the transaction data. We just did that right here, no problem. So that's the second one. The next one is we want to total all these transactions. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to need some kind of counter variable where we can actually do that. But if we just enumerate something in here, it's just going to keep writing it over and over and over again, and we're not going to get anything. So what we want to do is we want to create one globally up top. So sometimes global variables are bad, sometimes they're good, and just some R&D real quick to get totals, it's not a bad thing. So total value received equals 0. We're going to set it to 0 initially outside of the loop, and then we'll just keep adding to that number inside the loop. And so what we need to do is create a current value. So we can do that with the exact same code that we just did, but we're just going to set it to something, right? So we're going to say current value equals int transaction get value. It's the exact same thing as that, but we're just setting it to our current value. So actually, technically, we could just get rid of this print statement here, right? We don't really need to do that. And we'll just put this right above here because we don't need to print out every separate one anymore. We saw that we can get them. What we really need is the totals. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a thing here. We're just going to say the total value received plus or equals the current value. So all that does is on each iteration of the loop, it adds whatever's in this current value, adds up into the total received value, and then we can print that out. We could print it out every loop, or we could just print it out when it's done once, which is probably better. That's what we want. We want the total value of everything in this contract. So once the whole loop's done and it's done adding every transaction to that total value received, want to print it out once it breaks out of the loop. So we can do that here. And what we're going to do is add a little color in here. So we'll show you something else as well. So I'm going to paste this in here. So again, it is just a print statement. There's nothing too fancy going on here as far as the printing going, but we're adding colors, right? So we're outside of this loop. We're going to say print total contract value received. And then all we're printing is this total received value, which got added up in here. But since it's a global value, it just kept adding and it's outside of the scope. So it saves it. It doesn't go away after the scope of this for is done. But we're going to add a little color in here by saying FORE.red, FORE.green, so it's easier to see in the terminal. And to use that, all we have to do is import something called Colorama. And this is useful depending what kind of data you're parsing. If you want to flag on something, like maybe you were searching for special things within a database, social security numbers, and as your Python programming was printing out things, maybe you can highlight those sensitive data, something of that nature it's good for. So we're just going to show how to do that here. So from Colorama import FORE, and then we could just use that just the way that we did down here. So now we're going to say red for this part and green for that total value received, right? Money equals green. So let's see if that works here. What we anticipate seeing now is we're going to still see this transaction number because it, it's still printing. We didn't remove that, but we're only going to see one value at the very bottom. So we see we went up transaction 1, and our total value for this whole contract is 10 Ether.01 and some change, right? So that's how much is in this whole contract. Pretty easy to do. Now, I would also like to note that we're parsing out each transaction so we can grab other data from it and look at each thing individually. But there actually are some stuff within this API where if we cruise up in here, you can look and actually grab balances right from it, right? So you can go to single balance address, right? So we pop in the address, we just say balance as the action this time instead of internal transaction, and use our API key and it'll give us back that balance. We didn't have to do it the way we did. We just, added together all the internal transactions that went to it. We can actually get it from multiple addresses as well. So I encourage you to play with each one of those and compare and contrast the way we just did it, right? And see, which one works better for you. So we just did that. So now we have the total of the transactions. So that's pretty cool. No problem. We printed that out there. Oh, I just lost that. Let me see, Control X and Control V, so that's where we're printing those out. And we link through so now we want to loop through all the addresses and get the total funds stolen from all of those addresses together, right? Because we're only using a hard-coded address right now. Now, we already know how to do this, right? So we have a list of all the attackers' addresses right here, no problem, right? So what we want to do is we want to import that, and we actually did that within our monitor changes, if you remember. We did an attackers list. We stripped off any extra data like new lines, and we pulled in the attacker's address. I think I have that name something different in here right now. Oh, attacker address.text. Okay, cool. So let's import that. 1 second here. And we'll just paste that right up top. And again, right, we're just grabbing this attacker address.text. We're parsing it into a list called attackers list, and now we can use that list in our code to loop through everything. Now, how do we do that? Well, we are going to leverage some nested for loops. So we have our for loop down here. we're going to put another for loop here. And what's going to happen is we'll go through the one for loop of all the attacker's addresses. And for each address, we'll enumerate all the transactions in it. We'll print the total transactions per contract. And then outside of the whole loop, like both loops, we'll print all of the values together, if that makes sense here. So what we're going to want to do is put a for loop here. So we'll say for target address in attacker's list. So that just enumerates each of the addresses from the attacker's list, and then we can do something in there. So what we'll need to do is take all of these values and tab them in. And then now what happens is for each attacker's address, we're going to loop through each transaction and print out the total value received. We're going to have to make a couple changes here to some of the values so they make sense and they're inside or outside of the loops. So let's do that. Let's first put something outside of the whole loop to print all of the transaction values together that total up. And so we're going to use this total value received because, as you remember, that's a global variable. So it's just going to, as it goes through each iteration of this loop for every single address, it's just going to keep adding to this total value received over and over, and it's never going to reset. And then at the very end, when it gets done with everything, it'll then print total contract value received for all of the contracts. And then it'll say the total value received, which is the value of every single contract's money all at once. And then let's change this out to something else. We are going to also print out how much is in each contract as well. So let's do that. And we can do that in the same place because we want that to do that, you know, after that for loop ends, but before the second for loop ends, right? So once it goes through all of the transactions in this for loop, again, we want to print the value of that address in total. So I'm going to paste in something here. We need to make this value and address thing. So we will say, go through all the transactions, print out the value in that address in white and green. And then once everything's done, we'll take every single address that's added together with the total value received, which never gets reset because it's a global variable, and we'll print that out. But we need to create this value in address. And we want that to be within our for loop, but not outside. So for each attacker's address, we want a different value before it resets. So very simple here. We can say value and address equals 0. So for each address, so we grab an address from the attacker's list, we're going to go down here and we're going to add up all the transactions, and then we're going to print the value in that address, right? And that is going to be, we're going to make some changes here to get those values. And then once everything's done and every single address is done looping through, we then print out the total value from everything. We see how much the attacker scammed out of everybody from all of those addresses. So you make a couple changes here and add up a couple things. So what we're going to say is we need this total value received equals current value for this one down here, obviously. But now we need to do one for the total value received. However, this will get reset with each loop of all the transactions and the value, because every time it goes through this first loop, we are going to be setting this to 0. So value and address gets set to 0 for each address, but we are going to add the current value to the, actually not total value received, that would be the value and address, sorry. We duplicated that. So let's make another one here. Okay, so for each iteration of the address loop, we're going to add the current value to value and address and print it out. And that gives us all the value in one address. And then we're going to do our total value received, which does not get reset for each loop because it is a global value outside of all these loops up here. So this one never resets, it just keeps adding, but this one resets on each attacker's address and prints out at the end. So that should be everything we need. Let's just see what that actually looks like here. If we can do it, let's say Python And it looks like we're still getting all these transactions. We don't really need those. We're also getting a total value. So let's get rid of the noise here and get rid of this transaction that's printing on each thing here. So we get rid of this, print transaction count, and we'll X that out of there and save. And then we can say, do that again. So now we got value in its address. It resets. And then it says 13, 17, 12, 14, but then it adds all of these up with the one that doesn't reset, which is the total one, prints it down here. So this attacker stole 68 ether from everybody, but here's the value he stole in each of those addresses. So I'll just do a quick walk and talk through these loops at a high level, because if you're new to loops, it's going to confuse you. So there is our total value received that never gets reset because it's outside of all the loops. So these loops don't reset it with this 0, right? This is just always going to keep adding to. And we print that at the end of everything down here after we loop through every single address value. But then inside of this for loop, we create another one, value and address, right? Because we're saying each address in the attacker's list, we're going to get the value in that address, keep adding it up within this for loop down here. But once we get to the end of this for loop and we loop back up to the next address, we're going to set it back to 0 again. And that is why we have a different value under each address. But the one that doesn't reset just keeps adding to it and gives us our total value. So hopefully that makes sense if you've never really played with nested loops before. Based on when a loop ends, all the variables just die that are created in that loop, and that's why you have to recreate them again. Like this, we have to recreate this to value equals 0 after each iteration. So hopefully that makes sense. That is all the code for this one. I hope you learned something. The idea of these long format ones is just that people who want to learn Python can learn Python, and the short format ones, people who just want to see what we did to grab some of this data using the Etherscan APIs they might not have ever noticed existed, are able to do that. So it hits both people. That way I don't leave people out for this particular series, because I understand like a lot of these blockchain concepts and how to get this data is new to everybody, but Python is not new to everybody. So it's kind of a hard thing to juggle. So if you appreciate that, please comment in below. I'm kind of curious, how people are using this, if everybody's kind of looking at all the code, or if it's actually beneficial to do a quick overview of the code for people who don't care about, all the specifics. But I encourage you to actually go through each one of these and try to call these API calls with the knowledge that you just learned. And we'll do another video that looks at some different aspects of doing some forensics on this data. But for right now, sit with this and just try to do some of these on your own and reinforce these concepts we just did, and kind of make sure that you own them and understand them, and that you're able to use these Etherscan APIs to get at all the historical data. Now, also should be noted that if you try to do a search for, say, Etherscan Python, it'll actually bring up some GitHub stuff. And there actually is an API you can use where you can, pip install Etherscan Python, and you can say from Etherscan equals Etherscan, put in your API key and go from there. However, then we're relying on this particular, library to be updated by the person who created it. And it's not that cumbersome to just make our own call here. So that's why I just did it on our own. It's a little bit more flexible. We can do what we want. There's not required parameters. And, we don't have to worry about somebody updating it. And we can even classify all of this and make Python classes. Maybe we'll do that later on. We'll reconfigure all our code to make a, actual API class we can use for Etherscan on our own that we can keep up to date, or you can share that out with other people. Whatever you want to do, just different Python concepts. But like, subscribe, and please give me some feedback in the comments below, and let me know what you think. All right, thanks.